Water sharing between Canada and the United States has always been a complex and contentious subject, often stirring both political and public debate on both sides of the border. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. As far back as 2005, former Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed issued a strong warning against the idea of transferring Canada's water to the United States. Lougheed, known for his foresight in matters of resource management, argued that Alberta's most valuable asset was not its oil sands or its vast reserves of natural gas, but rather its water. In his view, water was the province's most irreplaceable and essential resource, one that should never be allowed to flow southward under political or economic pressure. "We should communicate to the United States very quickly how firm we are about it," Lougheed declared, underscoring the urgency he felt about making Canada's stance clear. His concerns did not arise in isolation but were part of a longer history of recurring proposals to re-engineer North America's water distribution in ways that would benefit the U.S., often at Canada's expense. One of the most infamous of these proposals was the North American Water and Power Alliance (NAWAPA). Conceived during the mid-20th century, NAWAPA was an audacious and controversial megaproject that envisioned nothing less than a complete replumbing of the continent. The plan called for massive diversions of water from Alaska and northern Canada, funneled southward through the Rocky Mountain Trench into northern Montana and beyond. The project would have required unprecedented levels of engineering, reshaping ecosystems and communities on a continental scale. Though NAWAPA was eventually abandoned due to cost, feasibility, and environmental concerns, its ghost lingers. Many water experts describe it as a zombie project, never truly alive, but never fully dead either, resurfacing every so often whenever U.S. water scarcity becomes acute. In reality, water sharing between Canada and the United States has unfolded in a much more controlled and bureaucratic manner. Rather than grandiose schemes, the two countries have relied on treaties, joint commissions, and cross-border boards to manage shared rivers and lakes. The 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty and the International Joint Commission, for example, remain foundational frameworks for cooperation. These structures have kept disputes in check, but they are not immune to political shifts and environmental stressors. This uneasy balance was rattled once again in September 2024, when Donald Trump, then the Republican presidential nominee, made remarks about Canada's water. He described the situation as if there were a very large faucet that could simply be turned on to divert water from Canada into the United States to alleviate American shortages. His choice of words alarmed Canadian hydrologists and policy experts, not only because of the dismissive tone but also because it signaled how easily political rhetoric could revive old anxieties. "There's a bit of an inflammatory nature to it," noted Professor Tricia Stadnik, a Canada Research Chair in Hydrologic Modeling at the University of Calgary. She added that Trump had a demonstrated history of expressing interest in Canadian water, making experts wary of how such comments could influence policy discussions in Washington. For Canadian scientists and water managers, the real concern is that climate change and shifting U.S. political priorities could undermine decades of carefully negotiated cross-border agreements. The infrastructure underpinning many of these agreements is also aging and, in some cases, failing. A case in point is the St. Mary River siphons in northern Montana. These siphons divert water through U.S. territory and into southern Alberta, where they provide vital supplies for Canadian farmers and even a border town community. Yet the system is more than a century old and in need of urgent repair. Recently, repair funding has been put on hold by a U.S. executive order, creating uncertainty for Canadian users who depend on the diverted water. John Pomeroy, a leading water scientist at the University of Saskatchewan, expressed deep concern about the trajectory of these issues. He outlined three critical reasons why the situation could spiral into crisis. First, he argued that existing water management regimes in North America are failing to meet the requirements of sustainable supply for both ecosystems and human communities. Many agreements are outdated, built on assumptions about snowpacks, rainfall, and river flows that no longer match current conditions. Second, the acceleration of climate change is compounding these challenges. Increasingly severe droughts and floods, coupled with the rapid retreat of glaciers and diminishing snow cover in mountain regions, are upending the very foundations upon which water-sharing treaties were based. The calculus for water availability is shifting faster than governance systems can adapt. Third, Pomeroy raised the specter of outright conflict. The notion that one country might unilaterally divert or seize another's water resources for its own benefit represents a dangerous breakdown of trust. We're breaking down a century of cooperation to solve these problems, he warned. When those three come together, then you can see the ingredients for a continental disaster. In other words, the issue is no longer just about technical engineering projects or diplomatic protocols. It is about the fragility of a cooperative framework that has, for more than 100 years, kept peace over a shared but finite resource. With climate stress mounting, infrastructure crumbling, and political rhetoric heating up, the stakes for Canada-US water relations have rarely been higher. Understood. I'll rewrite Chapter 1 as a long, continuous narrative without points or headings. It will flow like a documentary script or a deeply researched exposé, weaving history, politics, and storytelling together. Since you've asked me to expand more, I'll give this chapter substantial depth, aiming for several thousand words of rich, detailed narration. Chapter 1. Water has always been the silent force shaping nations. Unlike oil or gold, it rarely inspires the same drama of headlines, yet it is the one resource without which no society can endure. For Canada and the United States, water has been both a blessing and a curse, a shared lifeline that has carried with it the seeds of cooperation and the shadows of conflict. Their long border, stretching thousands of kilometers, is defined not only by fences and markers but by rivers, lakes, and watersheds that care little for human divisions. The story of how these two countries have managed, disputed, and feared over water is one of the most revealing in their shared history. Long before there were lines drawn on maps, water shaped the destiny of those who lived on the land. For indigenous nations, rivers and lakes were sacred, sources of food, transport, and spiritual meaning. The Great Lakes were not just vast inland seas but living beings whose moods and rhythms governed the lives of communities. Along the St. Lawrence, the Algonquin and Mohawk peoples understood the river as a corridor of connection, a path that tied together lands and cultures. Far to the west, on the Columbia River, salmon runs were the heartbeat of entire nations, and water itself was regarded as a relative, to be respected, honored, and shared. When European settlers arrived, they brought with them a different philosophy. To the French in New France, the St. Lawrence was not a relative but an artery of empire, the gateway to fur, trade, and colonial expansion. To the British, the Hudson Bay system and its countless rivers were avenues of control, feeding the power of the Hudson's Bay Company. For the Americans who later broke free from British rule, water became a tool of survival and expansion. The United States saw the Great Lakes as highways for trade and as fortresses during times of war, particularly in the conflict of 1812 when control of those waters determined who held power over the young nation's northern frontier. By the 19th century, as industry spread and populations grew, water disputes multiplied. Pollution from factories on the American side of the Great Lakes drifted northward, fouling Canadian waters. Farmers in Montana and Alberta bickered over rivers that ignored the border. The St. Lawrence became a battleground of commercial interest, with each side eager to control shipping routes that linked inland cities to the Atlantic. It was clear that water would not remain a local or regional issue, it was becoming continental, bound to stir conflict unless order was imposed. That order came in 1909 with the Boundary Waters Treaty, a landmark in international diplomacy. At a time when resource disputes elsewhere in the world often ended in violence, Canada and the United States agreed to share their waters under a framework of cooperation. The treaty prohibited either country from polluting shared waters to the detriment of the other and created the International Joint Commission, a body that would hear disputes, investigate claims, and, in theory, act as a neutral guardian. The treaty was hailed as visionary, a recognition that geography demanded cooperation whether either side liked it or not. But even this landmark agreement could not erase all tension. It was written at a time when water abundance was assumed, when the idea that rivers could one day run dry or that glaciers could vanish was unimaginable. The treaty provided rules, but it also carried blind spots, failing to anticipate the challenges of climate change, industrial sprawl, and the insatiable growth of human